let's try to get through this point of the Chilas Kohanim Bala Miskaprim. The Gemara says in Psachim, we know there is a mitzvah of Hashlama, which means the Korban Tamid Shel Bein HaArbayim, the Korban Tamid that was brought in the evening, needed to be the last Korban of the day. No Korbanos were allowed to be brought after it. There were exceptions. Concerning the exceptions, there is a machlekes, a dispute among the Tanoim, which Korbanos are the exceptions, in which cases are there exceptions. One Tana holds that the exception is on Erev Pesach, someone who has to bring a Korban Chatos on Erev Pesach because he is or she is culminating his or her purification process, at the end of which you need to bring a Korban. That's the last thing you need to do. Before you bring that Korban, you can't eat any kachim, you can't eat any meat from any Korbanos. So what happens on Erev Pesach, where there's an individual of that status who didn't bring the Korban? If you won't bring this Korban or she won't bring her Korban on that day, they will not be allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. The Korban Tamid is already brought. Says the Tanna Kama, in that case, you can bring the Korban Chatas after the Korban Tamid Shel Bein HaArbayim. You could bring the Korban that culminates the purification, although the Korban Tamid, the afternoon Korban Tamid, the afternoon constant Korban, was already brought. Because the esse of eating the positive mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach supersedes the positive mitzvah of the Korban Tamid being the last Korban. Why? Because the consequence of not eating the Korban Pesach in its time is karas, is to be cut off, God forbid, which shows the veracity of that mitzvah saseh, that positive mitzvah. So it overrides the mitzvah of Hashlama, of the Korban Tamid being the last Korban of the day. Clear? Clear. That's the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yishmael says, it doesn't have to be an Erev Pesach. It could be any other time of the year. Right? In that case also, what does it mean every other time of the year? Not that you're bringing a Korban Pesach. Let's say this individual who is now awaiting final culmination of the purification through bringing the Korban Chatos. Let's say they brought a Korban Shlomim on, I don't know, today. But they realized suddenly, after the Korban Tamid Shel Bein HaArbayim was brought, that they didn't bring their culmination Korban for the purification, which doesn't allow them to eat the meat from the Korban Shlomim that they brought. So even in that instance, says Rabbi Shmuel, they're also allowed to bring the Korban Chatos to culminate their purification after the Korban Tamid. Why? Because they have a mitzvah to eat from the meat of the Korban Shlomim, and if they don't bring the Korban, they won't be able to eat. So over here, there's a whole discussion. Why? Why does this positive? They're both positive mitzvahs. This is a mitzvah saseh. To eat the meat from the Korban Shlomim is a mitzvah saseh. For a positive mitzvah. For the Korban Tamid to be the last mitzvah is also a positive mitzvah. Why does this mitzvah saseh of eating the Korban Shlomim supersede the mitzvah saseh, the positive mitzvah of eating of ensuring that the Korban Tamid is the last one of the day? So one answer was that we're talking about what type of Korban? A bird Chatos. In which case there's no meat being burnt on the Mizbeach, only blood is sprinkled on the Mizbeach, right? And who eats the meat? Only the Kohanim. The Mizbeach, you don't burn anything on the Mizbeach. In that case, is no problem because it does not, even though you're bringing it after the Korban Tamid, but you're not actually burning anything on the Mizbeach, so you're not technically violating the mitzvah saseh, the positive mitzvah of bringing the Korban Tamid as the last Korban of the day. That's one opinion. Rav Papa says no. You could even say that we're talking about not bringing a bird Korban Chatos, but even an animal Korban Chatos, in the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. but how is it? How don't you violate the mitzvahs asay of the korban tamid being the last korban of the day? He says no problem. You shech the korban chatos, you sprinkle the blood, you take the parts of the korban chatos that need to be burnt on the mizbeach and you bring them up to the altar, but you don't burn them because you can't burn them because the korban tamid is already brought. You leave it there overnight. In the morning you bring the korban tamid shel shachar, the tamid offering of the morning, and then you burn the korban chatos. And that will allow that individual to eat his karm shlamim when? Even the preceding day, in the evening. Says the Gemara, this is the crux of it. How could you say, this is not a solution? Why is it not a solution? It's not a solution because we know it says in the Pasuk, he says, because it's not a solution, because atonement, when does the atonement of the korban take effect? When does the atonement of a korban take effect for the one who brings that korban? After the kohanim eat. In a korban chatos, there were parts of the korban that were what? That the kohanim ate. There were parts of the korban that were burnt on the mizbeach. And the order was that first you burnt it on the mizbeach, and that only then were the kohanim allowed to eat their part. So long as the part of the korban that needs to be burnt on the mizbeach was not offered up onto the mizbeach, was not burnt on the mizbeach, the kohanim could not eat the part that is designated for them. And until the kohanim eat the part that's designated for them, the owner of the korban, the one that brought the korban, the offering, hasn't achieved atonement because kohanim eichlim ubaylim miskaprim. The kohanim eat their part of the korban, and that causes the owner of the korban to be atoned for the korban to take effect. So what are you saying to me that you bring the korban chatas and you put it up onto the altar until the next morning after the korban tamid from the morning, and that will allow the owner of the korban shlamim, the same one who's bringing the korban chatas, to eat his korban when? The preceding night, after the korban tamid shel bein ha'arbayim, after the evening korban of the preceding day. It doesn't work. Because so long as that meat of the chatas wasn't burnt on the mizbeach, the kohanim can't eat their part in that korban chatas. And if the kohanim don't eat their part of the korban chatas, the one that brought the korban did not achieve atonement. And if he didn't achieve atonement, he still didn't technically bring the korban chatas. So how could he eat from his korban shlamim? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara answers that in a case like this, the emurim, the part of the korban that needs to be brought on the mizbeach, will have the same status as emurim that have gotten lost. What happens if somebody brings a korban and they brought the emurim, the parts of the korban that need to be brought on the mizbeach, they took that meat and they put it on the mizbeach, and then suddenly it was misplaced. So the halacha is, it doesn't matter. It's considered because it's because of the circumstances. He still has kapara. He still achieves atonement, despite the fact that what? I'm sorry. The kohanim are still allowed to eat their part, despite the fact that the emurim were not brought on the mizbeach. The part of the korban that needs to be burnt on the mizbeach wasn't brought. The kohanim are still allowed to eat their part. Why? Because of the circumstances. You can't burn it on the mizbeach, so it's considered as if it was already burnt, and therefore the kohanim could eat their part. In this instance, since you can't burn the meat until the following day, after the korban tamid of the morning was brought, so up until that point, it's considered as if there's a technical problem with the emurim, and therefore the kohanim could eat their part, and therefore the person who brings the korban receives atonement, and therefore could eat his korban shlamim the preceding day. That's the Gemara. How do we know this din that kohanim eichlim and bailam miskaprim, that it is the kohanim's consumption of their part that causes the atonement for the one that brings the korban? Because there's a pasuk. In the Torah, in connection to designating Aaron and his sons as kohanim, when Hashem tells Moshe, bring Aaron and his sons to serve as kohanim in the Mishkan, in the Beis Hamikdash, Hashem commands Moshe that they should bring certain sacrificial offerings. Among them was a ram, which Aaron and his sons were to eat along with sacrificial bread. They had to bring lechem and ayil and so on and so forth. So what does the Torah say concerning this korban? The verse the Torah uses is "Ve'ochlu oisam asher kupar bohem lemale es yodam lekadish oisam v'zor lo yechal ki kodesh hem. This is in Shemos, chapter 29. It says like this: and they, the priests, shall eat those things wherewith atonement was made. So these words, asher kupar bohem, wherewith atonement was made, teaches that the priests eat and the owners achieve atonement. What's the takeaway from this whole long discussion? The takeaway from this whole long discussion is that it is the consumption of the kohenim, when the kohenim eat their part of the korban, which is designated for them, that causes atonement for the one that brings the korban. What does this mean in the context of the Maimah? The Rebbe said like this. We learned in Ois Beis, on top of page Chavtes, the Rebbe said that from Hey Ochel Ochel we learned that there are two types of consumption, if you remember. There's the consumption of the Mizbeach and the consumption of the Kohenim. You remember we had the whole discussion about pigul. If you have an intention to eat it outside of its time, the korban becomes invalid, it becomes rejected immediately. And then the Gemara discusses at what stage in the sacrificial process does such an intention cause it to be rejected, cause it to be in the status of pigul. So the Gemara said it's also in reference to what? To the different aspects of bringing the korban, like sprinkling the blood, bringing the emurim, and so on and so forth. Why? Because there is consumption of man and there's consumption of the kohenim. Right? Says the Rebbe, the question was, how could you compare the consumption of man and the consumption of the Mizbeach? So the Rebbe asked, how can you compare the consumption of a human and the consumption of the Mizbeach? There are two different types of consumption. Even more so, says the Rebbe, that's where our Gemara now comes in. Obi Yisrael and move on. 4 lines from the top of the page on page Chavtes, it's even more not understood. Shematzina, we find sheyesh ma'ila b'achilas adam al achilas mizbeach. We find that there is a qualitative virtue in the consumption of man over the consumption of the altar. In other words, man's consumption, the kohenim's consumption, the consumption of the kohenim is in a higher status than what? Than the consumption of the mizbeach. K'maymer, as our sages teach in Masechet Pesachim, in the tractate of Pesachim, which we just discussed at length. Kohenim oichlim u'bailim miskaprim. The kohenim eat and the owners are atoned, which means what? V'hainu she'achilas kohenim, the consumption of the kohenim, she'achilas adam, which means human consumption. Poyelas mashlei po'al achilas mizbeach. That effectuates that which the consumption of the mizbeach did not effectuate, because the consumption of the mizbeach is not sufficient for what? For achieving atonement for the one that brings the korban. It's only when the kohenim consume, when the humans eat, that brings about consumption for the owner of the korban. Says the Rebbe, we have a problem. What's the problem? In a movement, this is not understood. Why is it indeed that the consumption of the kohenim is that which brings about atonement for the owner of the korban? It's not understood. The consumption of the mizbeach of the altar, that means offering a korban. When you're bringing a korban to Hashem, what does that mean? You're bringing it to the Beis Hamikdash and you're offering it up onto the altar, right? And concerning korbanos, concerning sacrificial offerings, and the power of a sacrificial offering, concerning this, it is said in the Zohar, Roza de kurbana oila ad roza de ensof. The secret of a korban, of the sacrificial offerings, rises up all the way up until the secret of the Ein Sof, the infinite. So, in other words, which aspect of bringing the korban, when you say that when the Zohar says the secret of a korban goes up all the way to the secret of Ein Sof, in other words, that's the power of a korban. That's how powerful a korban is. What is that a reference to? Bringing it up onto the mizbeach, on the altar. How could we say if that's the case, how could we say that the consumption of a human, and it just said, it is the consumption of the kohenim that achieves atonement for the owner of the korban, which seems to be putting it at a higher status than what? Than the consumption of the mizbeach. From the rosa the kurban elad rosa the insaf, it would seem that what? That it's bringing up the offering onto the altar that has that power of a korban. Another 2 lines. Another couple of lines. Chapter 3, Ubir Inyan, to explain this idea. So in other words, to sum up, let's just pause here for a moment to sum up. Let's get back onto the thread. We began with the idea of the malachim, the angels eating. The Rebbe goes into the discussion, what's so great about the angels eating? It seems that there's something special about the angels eating, right, when they came to visit Abraham. The Rebbe brought the two opinions whether they actually ate or it only seemed like they ate. From the Medrash it seems that it only seemed like they ate. From the Zohar it seems that they actually ate. And it seems from the way the pasuk is constructed, Avram stood over them under the tree and they ate, that the eating of the malachim was achieved through the fact that Avram Avinu was standing over them. So we need to understand, the Rebbe said, what does it mean? What's so special about the malachim eating, according to both interpretations, whether it only seemed like they were eating or they actually ate? And why is it only achieved through Avram Avinu standing over them? That was the question in the first part of the Maggah. The second part of the Maggah, the Rebbe begins to explain this by dissecting what is eating. What type of eating is there? So the Rebbe quoted that there is the consumption of, there is human consumption, where you bring a korban, right? There is the human consumption, the parts of the korban that are eaten by the person, and then there are parts of the korban that are offered up onto the Mizbeach. So the Rebbe said, and this the Gemara learns, from a verse in Vayikra which says, and if indeed you shall eat, if it should be eaten at all, because the verb is doubled, this implies that there are two types of eating. One is the eating of the human, one is the eating of the Mizbeach. But since they're all learned from both types of consumption, are learned from the same two words that are next to each other, you're comparing the two. Says the Rebbe, how can you compare human consumption and Mizbeach consumption, altar consumption? Even more so, says the Rebbe, it would seem that human consumption is on a higher level. Why? Because, as we just explained at length, it is the Kohenim's consumption that achieved atonement for the one that brought for the one that brought the korban. Then the Rebbe took it to another step and he said, on the other hand, the power of a korban, which rises up to the essence of the Ein Sof, to the secret of the Ein Sof, seems to be referring to what? To burning it on the Mizbeach, the consumption of the Mizbeach. And over here it seems that the eating of the human being is at a higher level. So this is the background, the context in which the Rebbe is going to explain the idea of eating. What is this idea of eating? And why is it so necessary and so powerful to the extent that it was so important in bringing the korban? And through that to understand what was this greatness of the malachim eating in the context of Avram. And here, hopefully, we'll be able to get into the actual...